Just cancel your plans, put on your thickest socks, and settle in to your cozy spot. Aaron, it's the middle of summer, my guy. Thick socks? I know we're trying to go for the comfy vibe here, but I ain't trying to die. You know the one. The 66 Director's Take is now live, and then he tweeted this out with it. 66 Director's Take blog, and look at the size of that damn thing. I know it's not actually that, but I thought it was a nice touch. The reason why this is such a big deal, if you don't know the backstory, is that lots of people have been split on which one's better. And there's good arguments for both. There's actually very good arguments for both. I've always wanted to wait until they finally said their line of reasoning, because their line of reasoning is the best form of judgment, in my opinion. If you go over their line of reasoning, as opposed to whatever shit, and I mean this well to both of them, they know I don't mean harm, whatever shit Samino and Frito come up with doesn't matter. What matters is what they've been thinking and the way they've looked at it. Because one, they have more data than us, and two, they're actually the people that get to make the decision. So it doesn't matter how right you think Frito is, or how right you think Sam is, or how right you think some random person on TikTok is. It legitimately doesn't matter. Now it matters. So now it'll be time to actually kind of take a look at what we want to do. Here's the thing. There's certain things like, for example, queue times, right? You talk about queue times, and there's evidence for both sides. Like, some people say queue times helped a ton, going 5v5, and then some people look back at like old tweets from like 2022 or 2023 and are like, well, they said in this one random tweet that like got like 17.5 likes that it wasn't actually a queue time issue. And it's like, okay, like maybe, but like one person's personal Twitter account that works at the company will be like, no, that wasn't our original decision. You know, like that's not like enough evidence. We got more. We need more than that, right? I want to hear what everything says, and then I think I'm ready to finally give my own version of how I feel about everything. Chat, this tweet came out earlier from Aaron. As I've read earlier to you, I'll read it one more time. Cancel your plans. Thickest socks, time to settle in for a cozy spot. You know the one. The 66 Director's Take is now live, and the Play Overwatch account also tweeted it as well. Calvary retweeted with an amazing Absolute Cinema meme. And the reason why I wrote Absolute Cinema is because I'm going to hide my camera for a sec so you can see how small the bar is. Holy mother of this thing is an actual monster. This is like a college level thesis on 5v5 versus 6v6. The day the war has officially begun is today. The war technically officially starts today. This is the first beginning. Yeah, the shot heard around the world. This is like the beginning of the 5v5 versus 6v6 war. Everything before was small skirmishes and like a Cold War. Now it's officially begun, because now we get to see what they actually think and feel, and they have more data than any of us have. So it's time. I've kept you all waiting long enough. Let's begin. Director's Take, opening up the conversation on 5v5 and 6. Hey everyone. By the way, this is written by Aaron Keller. Hey everyone. There's been a lot of talk about 6v6 lately, and it's only intensified in recent weeks since we posted our latest Director's Take, made a Twitter post with a promise to talk about it in the future. Well, now it's the future, and this is the next piece. So, let's get to it. Wait, let's not get to it quite yet. You know, I feel somewhat responsible for this. Because when I did my interview with Aaron months ago, I wanted to ask him about the 6v6 conversation, and I was asked respectfully not to ask the question and that they would address it later. And so here we are. So I feel slightly responsible for this. But yeah. So you knew? I literally told you literally after the interview ended, like literally a minute after it ended, I said, hey, I didn't ask about 5v5 and 6v6 because of this. And I have told you guys before as well. You guys know that. That's public info. This is a pretty complex and nuanced topic, and I guess the beating heart of what makes the game tick. Our players have different opinions and preferences about the ideal number of players in an Overwatch match, and so does our team. We're a microcosm of the broader community and discuss this internally. I'm hoping that this piece will serve as an introduction to our own discussion and a jumping off point to engage with all of you. All right, ground rules. I was going to say, I wonder if this is going to be ground rules. I'd like to set some expectations and ground rules. First, it's pretty long. Creators are going to lose their voices reading this one out loud. Okay, dude. All right, relax. You didn't have to call us out that bad. If you'd like a TLDR, the what's next section should suffice. Secondly, I'm not here to tell you what you ought to like, or even what's empirically better. This is a game, and your preferences for fun is relative to your own tastes, ability, and experience. Lastly, there are years of decisions that affect such a fundamental piece of Overwatch. Some of you might be intimately aware of these, while others might not. Before diving in, I'd like to set the stage and give some context on the larger changes to the game that ultimately culminated in the 5v5 format that we have today. All right, I know a lot of the history already. Maybe not their internal history, but I know the public history, so we'll see. It is true. They are 100% right. A lot of these decisions, like let's say today they went, okay, we're going back to 66. It would take like years of things to like undo it all and like go back to like making it formatted well. It would take a lot of work. So it's not something you can just turn on tomorrow. Historical context. There's been 3 large format changes to Overwatch, and the first happened shortly after the game launch, which was hero limits. Before this, you could be any number of particular heroes on one team. You could have 6 Genjis or 6 Reinhardts. And my memory serves me right, the winner of Team 4's first internal tournament was one with Winston and 5 Zenyatas. We called it Quinston. Zenyatta orbs stacked with no cap to healing at the time. It was glorious and terrifying. If you are an old head like me, you remember 6 Divas Hanamura and the nightmare that it brought. During early development, it was necessary to have duplicate heroes per team. Our first core combat milestone only had 4 heroes. As the roster grew, this was no longer necessary, and it also introduced issues. Overwatch heroes have very distinct kits with impactful abilities. Stacking abilities could be fun, but it then posed challenges to balancing many of those abilities in game. People reference double barrier, but back then you could have 6. Imagine cycling 6 immortality fields. Oh man, there's too many low-hanging fruit jokes about like people screaming at 6 Suzus or 6 immortality fields like fucking strapped down. The number of team compositions and strategies available was huge. The variety was great, but we didn't feel like we could ever truly balance the game without severely watering down our heroes. So we made the choice to impose a limit of 1 of each hero per team. This essentially solved the issue of ability stacking, but it did have a few side effects. It traded some of the creativity in putting together team compositions for a more consistent and balanced experience. It also took away some choice from players. If someone wanted to play Tracer, but you were already Tracer, they would be unable to. A theme of this and future decisions was limiting match variety as well as player freedom and creativity in order to create more balanced, consistent, and competitive experience for players. Remember, this point, because we'll touch on it a few times in this piece, I think the hero limit rule was a great decision, and we would make it again. The other 2 large format changes have a lot of positive benefits, but are not as clear-cut. I agree with them 100% all the way through. The second large change to the game's format was the move from open queue to role queue, which limited team compositions to 2 heroes from each role. Before a role queue, there was no enforced 2-2-2 team composition, and players had the freedom to select any role they liked once they loaded into the match. With open queue, teams had a lot of freedom of choice about what heroes and team compositions to play, but there was quite a few problems that role queue intended to address. Prior to implementing role queue, there was a stark imbalance in the number of people playing each role within each match. Damage was, by far and still is today, the most popular role, and tank was, by far, the least popular. In fact, seeing matches with 5 or 6 or even 6 damage players on each team was not uncommon. This is completely true. I think role queue was good for the game, strictly because of this. Because the opposite end of the extreme was goats. Goats was what the high level players would play because they were playing to win constantly. You'd have more communication. You had more people that actually it's why for the longest time playing in GM top 500 was thought as the promised land, right? Like every competitive player wanted to make it to GM, and it was so bad that when Overwatch League in 2018 formed in LA, all the best players went to LA. And so I did this too, because I wasn't a streamer at the time. I was just some random competitive player, and I liked getting better games because I was like 42, 43, 44, 4500, which is like mid to middle top 500 at the time. And I liked the higher level games because all the good players tried and all the pro players actually tried at the time. I would VPN to West Coast to get better games, and players wanted to play in the best games possible. This worked in open queue at high level because people typically tried to win and wanted to win and do their best. But what would happen is if you had one player that wanted to play Genji and the rest of the team's playing goats, that one person threw your game. The reverse would also happen. You'd get a free win if they had a Genji and you didn't, and your team ran full goats. But on the lower end of the ladder, your diamonds and below, you'd have games with 3, 4, 5, 6 DPS on one team where everyone sits there and looks at each other and goes, no, I'm not picking that. I'm not playing those heroes. You play it first. And they all sit there and they get argue with each other, and it's a terrible time. So role queue solved that. Role queue, in my opinion, was good for the game. This role imbalance infrequently led to wild imbalanced teams between matches. The game played better when heroes from all 3 roles were selected. This display caused social issues as players would try to pressure others into playing tank or support roles, as I was just saying. Even if they didn't want to, it made balancing heroes more difficult since we couldn't balance around a certain role ratio for each team. And it even made introducing new heroes more difficult, since any new hero kit had to take into consideration hundreds of different team compositions and abilities that could overlap with it, and move into a role queue format that was aimed to mitigate these challenges. Didn't talk about the higher level play versus low level play with goats, but anyways. Moving to role queue solved many of these problems and added some additional benefits to the game as well. With role queue in place, matchmaking is based on skill within a given role, not just overall skill. Some players have wildly different skill ratings per role, true. So the ability to matchmake around set roles provides a big, measurable boost to matchmaking quality. Role queue also solidified the identity of each role, and the fantasy of doing the role job became clear. However, the switch to role queue system did have some downsides, the largest of which was much longer queue times. Prior to role queue, the matchmaker just needed to find 12 players of similar skill in order to put the matches together. After role queue, it needed to find 4 players of each role. 4 players of each role? Oh yeah, 4. Duh, 1 for each team. To make a match. The total number of players queuing has no effect on this. It's almost solely governed by the ratio of people queuing for the least popular role. Given the game's lower relative ratio of players queuing for tank than the other damage and support roles, queue times went way up. We'll go into the details on this later. Interesting. So it sounds like role queue or queue time is going to play a big part of this. The team tried to address this imbalance in various ways. We introduced a priority pass system that gave players who played low demand heat roles tank a shorter queue when they switched to damage. This had a positive effect for several weeks, but its influence quickly faded. We also introduced, I want to talk about that in a sec. They also introduced systems to reward players for playing tank, eventually giving them a loot box and a bunch of XP for queuing for that role. None of these were able to put a dent in the demands for playing DPS. Damage queues times drifted a bit lower over time, but much of this was due to the introduction of open queue competitive and the permanent loss of damage players unwilling to wait for a long. There were additional drawbacks with role queue. I mentioned earlier that many of our decisions made improvements to the game at the cost of match variety and player freedom. Team compositions were now locked to 2-2-2. There was another step to a more consistent experience with within Overwatch. But sometimes consistency can start to feel samey. There was some pretty exciting metas in the pre-role queue world, and swapping to a hero of a different role mid-match was often a bigger change and more exciting than swapping to one of the same role, like hero limits. Role queue took away a part of the freedom in selecting heroes that served as the base of Overwatch. but I often wonder if the success of it is as cut and dry as that of Hero Limits. Could there be an in-between version that softens the original problem without completely solving them? And also, isn't quite as restrictive as our current role queue system. A bit more on that later. So really quick, something that's not addressed here. It's really not that important, so I understand why they didn't go into it, but the whole thing they were talking about with adding priority passes to try to make people play tank, it just became DPS players playing fucking hog in ranked, and just basically just running it down mid, trying to get passes, and if they won, they got 3. If they lost, they only got 1. So either way, they'd still at least get 1 no matter what. So a lot of times they'd try, but they would only play hog, and it was annoying, and it was shit, right? I guess that kind of feeds into the whole narrative of people not liking hog players. There's a lot of history there. But yeah, they did do a lot of things to try to make people play tank, and unfortunately, people just didn't want to play the game and didn't want to play the role, and you can't blame them for it. It's a hard role to balance. It's a hard role to make people play, and that's, I think, honestly, a really strong basis for where this is probably they're gonna argue for the 5v5 later on. Okay, the third major format change. These changes, as well as longer queue times, led us to the third and most recent major format change to the game, the shift from 6v6 to 5v5. This is almost as a blog within a blog, and we're going to cover 3 things. Why we switched to 5v5, queue times after the switch to 5v5, and what the team thinks about 6v6. Oh my, I can't believe I'm reading this in the real timeline. Why we switched to 5v5, the official answer. There were many reasons behind the transition to 5v5. And when we launched Overwatch 2, we talked about the greater individual agency that players could have in 5v5. Overwatch is a team sport, and it requires players to rely on each other to be successful. This was even more the case previously, and the game could be frustrating if your team was out of sync. Many times fights in 6v6 couldn't resolve until ultimate abilities came online. Correct that, until ultimate combos could be executed to break through 2 tanks worth of mitigation supported by high, uncontested healing output. The world of 6v6 could have really high highs, but really low lows. One of the design goals of 5v5 was to try to raise that floor, and even though it was at the expense of some of those high moments. I completely agree. However, I do think there's something to be said about one of the biggest game types for that was 2CP. 2CP was the game mode where you had to be correct with your ults to win. And if you did not use your ults correctly, you lost. And that was why typically really good teams capped both points with 3 minutes left, and teams that were struggling would cap in overtime. The reason they would cap in overtime is because teams would play for overtime spawns and have ults online, and it was basically just a ult building simulator. Not every game mode played like that though, but that was the one that felt like this the most. But I do agree with their sentiment. Overwatch 2 also had a greater emphasis on FPS gameplay. There's less damage mitigation and CC, and players get to shoot at enemies more. Crowd control could take players out of the game for extended periods of time, that old XQC clip, especially when they were chained back to back. A 5-second Sombra hack, May freeze on her primary fire, Brig Bash on a sleep, Orisa halt, and Sigma Rock could often all happen consecutively to one player, typically a tank, who could not survive this onslaught. At least in-game, their real-life mental health was another story. Jesus Christ! Okay. Damage heroes often complain that their role was the least impactful relative to the strength of super powerful tank synergies and support heroes undoing their playmaking. That has some merit to it. The emphasis on ability cooldown management, ult tracking, shooting barriers instead of players, and not big enough timing windows to just shoot enemies and get eliminations were all factors that contributed to this feeling. Support heroes also had to focus almost exclusively on healing, since they were bigger team health pools and more incoming damage on the field with the additional tank player. 5v5, they have more agency and add more damage to or duels to other heroes. That's true. That is true. However, though, there is something to be said that damage creep has also happened. And so those supports do more damage, and so they actually can win those duels. So instead of healing your teammate to keep them alive because they will win the fight, they can do it themselves. Also definitely contributes to that, because like I think Kiri in early Overwatch 2 was a great example of why heal my team when I can just walk into their backline, kill 2 people, Susan myself, and TP out for free, right? Tank synergy wasn't always fun. It slowed the game down and stabilized it, but sometimes it absolutely ground it to a halt. People point to the double shield meta as an example of this. It wasn't just about double shields though. The ability to stack able to stack a very defense heavy lineup, especially in game modes that required a team to push through a small choke, so 2CP, caused a lot of matches to feel like there was no progress at all. The game is faster now, and it doesn't typically stall out. It feels like there is more room to move around a map without the need to earn every inch of it. In 5v5, fights are often less focused on moving around in a death ball formation, and there is more room to take angles, flank, and duel other players, which brings in more of that FPS gameplay. I actually agree with this, but I also disagree with the sentiment. I actually don't like it as much anymore. The reason for that is not every hero can take those flanks and do those flanks, and not every hero is able to even deal with those flanks, but at least in the first one, you had to play as a team and grind for those inches together. While now, it's like, especially from the tank POV, sometimes you're walking up like 2v5, and you're like, what the fuck's going on? And you don't realize that like, your soldier's on the flank, your widow's on the flank, your Ana's fucking mouse disconnected, your Kiri's in their backline right now. And so it kind of really swung it so far away from the MOBA FPS that Overwatch is to more of a traditional style FPS, which some people would argue is good. I'd argue it's not quite Overwatch. I do think it was better. I do think in a lot of ways it was good, but I do think that in a lot of ways it just kind of killed the magic of Overwatch. Because like, if you want to play a true FPS competitive shooter where your gunplay is the biggest thing, you play CS or you play Val, right? Hell, even Apex, if you want to talk about a game with a movement shooter, like has like more movement, but also you're more, well, I guess controller's taking over that game. Okay, Apex pre-controller fucking apocalypse, right? Where it was a lot of like the tap strafing, you had the streamer building, we go boom, 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 right? Right? And people would like show off their clips of them, you know, 1v3ing teams in there with their movement and their gunplay. Now it's just controllers everywhere. But actually, the controllers everywhere almost could be a good argument where it's become more accessible for every player. But by doing that, they've kind of made the game worse. Anyways, let's continue. While 6v6 can have high moments, it's also hard to follow. Tracking 9 other players is easier than 11. There are fewer visual effects on the screen, especially during big team fights. Overwatch is a pretty demanding game, and moving to 5v5 made it more cognitively manageable. I disagree. Lastly, one of the biggest benefits of 5v5 was dramatically reduced queue times. Let's explore that. Okay, you got that. You got a point there. Really quick. No. No, you're not. I'm sorry, Aaron. You guys aren't getting away with this one. Lifeweaver fucking tree building forests out of nowhere. In those comps where you still have lots of people that do stuff, you could still have double sims, you could have double sigs, you can have double mays, you can have a Lifeweaver. Like, if you truly wanted to make the fucking visual clutter game mode Ram ult, Mauga ults, oh my god, Maugas with 2 echoes, where it's 4 Maugas, 4 cages, with two Lifeweavers. Yeah, okay, the fucking visual clutter got tuned down. Let's pump the brakes on that one. If you want to play with the logic of, well, it is tuned down because it is one less player, it would be even worse with a 6th player. You do have a point. You are technically correct. But you could say that with literally any game. at that point, right? Like you have a whole less player. I would say that the design philosophy of Overwatch 2's heroes completely counteracts the argument of them being less chaotic and less clutter. I've been playing Marvel Rivals for the last few days. That game has so much fucking clutter. But I wonder if that's what that game looks like to non-Overwatch players. Like, does Overwatch look like that to non-Overwatch players? Anyways, let's continue. Here's the big one. Queue time, data, and context. The chart below shows ranked play. Queue times per role after the introduction of role queue to Overwatch in 2019 compared to queue times per role in Overwatch 2's 5v5 role queue format. As you can see, the shift to 5v5 role queue dramatically reduced queue times for players in all roles, and most notably the damage role, which was the most popular role. Average competitive role queue times. Time in minutes. Overwatch 6v6 post role queue. DPS 7.6 minutes. Overwatch 2 5v5's lifetime 2.9. Overwatch post role queue support 2.8. Overwatch 2 5v5 lifetime 1.4 minutes. Tank, Overwatch 6v6 post roll queue, 1.8 minutes. Overwatch 2 5v5 lifetime, 1.3 minutes. It's actually surprising that tank and support is this close. It's never really felt that close. Sometimes it does. But there was a while there where a few months that support was very long queue times. Interesting. That's actually extremely interesting. Okay, I don't want to have any crazy conspiracy theories, but like, clearly the big problem in the room is not the tank role, it's actually the DPS role. Anyways, the biggest factor driving the difference between Overwatch and Overwatch 2 queue times is the ratio of players queuing for each role. We hear players speculate that long queue times are a result of not enough players playing Overwatch, and that isn't the case. But instead, that's relative to the other roles. Players generally queue tank less, leading to longer wait times for all, while we wait for a tank to free up to find a proper match. I have so many thoughts on this. I don't know if I should save it for later or just say it now. I am hitting the point where we all realize tank sucks balls. And you can't buff it to the moon, and you can't make it worse. You probably couldn't ever do a world where 7v7's an answer, right? 2-3-2. Is that an because there's only one other option at that point, and I don't like the other option. The other option at that point, chat, is to go the opposite way. And the reason I don't like the opposite way is because the maps are too small. Or sorry, the maps are too big. It would just be too open. We tried it one time. Me and Karq tested it one night, like way back towards the beginning of Overwatch 2. Map design would be a problem then? Map design's a problem now. I would argue that going one extra player would be better than going one less player on each team than currently. At least to me, it's very clear that the damage roll is the problem. And looking at the ratios here for players and queue times from Overwatch 1 specifically, hell, even Overwatch 2, it's not like there's, well, I mean, I guess there kind of is double the amount of DPS players. Fuck. Okay. So in practice, the actual ratio of players queuing for tank, damage, and support is much closer to the current 1-2-2 format than the previous 2-2-2 format. As a result, the 5v5 role queue format better mirrors actual player interest in each role, and making the switch resulted in shorter queues. The sharp drop-off in queue times in October 2022 is when Overwatch 2 along with 5v5 shipped. The queue times of all heroes dropped and are now much shorter than they were in the 6v6 world. This is almost all because the game requires one less tank in a match. If you look at the current queue times, you see you can see there is still a lack of tanks compared to the other roles. Just flipping the switch and returning to 6v6 would likely cause a return to the previous queue times or worse. Self-fulfilling prophecy? No. This data from Roll Q 2019 tells you that's fucking bullshit. That's not true. Regardless, all right, sorry, where were we? Towards returning previous queue times, of course. Okay, regardless of the amount of players in game, queue times are always reflective of how many players are queued per role. In other words, the main driver of increased queue times is the ratio of players queued in each role. Since there are less players queuing as tanks, queues would likely go back to the way they were before. That's probably true because like they already have data from 2019 that would show that the date, like the matches would look like that, or queue times would look like that. But if I'm completely honest, like the game just feels terrible in its current format compared to what it once was. And I don't know how to fix that with the current format. So it becomes like, what do you think is worse? The game being bad, but the queues being long, or the queues being short, but the game being bad? Bad is subjective though, because there's a lot of players that absolutely do enjoy today's Overwatch. That is absolutely true. There are lots of players that do. If you take that into account, it's kind of hard to argue it. But that being said, I would have loved to see what tank queue times looks like nowadays as opposed to lifetime, because tank at the beginning of Overwatch 2 is very different than tank nowadays. Granted, I'm asking for a lot at that point. Maybe I, in the future, if I get another chance to ever talk to Aaron, we can bring that up to him, be like, hey, what's it look like nowadays? But yeah, regardless, I do think that they have a point, that it would probably look very much like that at this time. But man, I don't know. DPS is really DPS is more the problem than tank, it feels like. It feels like tank is less of a problem than DPS. There's just so many DPS players. Hey, good problem to have. A lot of people want to play your role, right? Like people want to play DPS. Okay. Thoughts on 6v6. The game started its life with 6 players on each team. I discussed why we moved away from 6v6, but that doesn't mean it's without any merit. There were moments and madness that could happen with 12 players in a match that just don't quite coalesce that when there are 10. It was almost too much to keep track of. Correction, it was too much to keep track of at times. But that was part of the charm. There are big moments in Overwatch 2, but they don't quite have the same chaotic, over-the-top feeling to them. Part of that chaos allowed players to feel less pressure in a match. There was an extra player to take up a bit of slack for someone that was performing poorly, and since that player was a tank, they had quite a bit of impact. There were a lot more hit points and defensive capabilities to burn through, which had a stabilizing effect on gameplay. Teams would fold a bit slower than they do now. That's true. Sometimes, and okay, I feel like this almost plays into the fact that like you get that guy on your team, right, who you lose 2 fights in a row and just goes, yeah, GG's, this game's over. And that didn't always used to happen, like as often as it does today, right? Like in my own personal experience, right? I could be totally wrong on that, but in my years of playing, I feel like people give up so much faster in Overwatch 2 than they did in Overwatch 1. Part of that could be because Overwatch 1 was a lot of hardcore players. But I wonder if that like team wipes twice in a minute and a half type of feeling, you're just like, yeah, this game's over. But in Overwatch 1, because it took so much longer to happen, you didn't feel like the game was as unwinnable. That's very interesting. I've never thought about it that way. We went over some of the issues of tank synergy earlier, but having 2 of them allowed one to focus on protecting their backline while the other had held ground or pushed the enemy team. True. Actually, there's actually a portion of the tanks that legitimately still don't make sense in Overwatch 5v5. D.Va's the big one. Zarya is another big one. They are just designed fundamentally to not work in 5v5, and that feels really shit. And it sucks that there isn't that dynamicness anymore. The tank role had a lot of depth in understanding how to work with the other tank on the team. This part of the mastery curve took a long time to learn, and for a small group of people devoted to it, it was part of the allure. I'd argue, though, actually today's tank is even harder. I think Aaron's right, but I also think today's is even more difficult. We mentioned the difficulty in balancing tanks for 6v6 earlier, but the past year and a half has shown us that there are issues with balancing tanks for 5v5 as well. For much of Overwatch 2, tanks have been fairly balanced, but with one of them becoming a powerful outlier like Mauga, that can be felt strongly in the world of one tank. But here's the deal. You now have to do 2 jobs in one, but you also have the power of 2 characters in one, right? So here's the deal. Yes, it was very hard to learn tank in Overwatch 1. Yes, it was very difficult. Yes, there was a lot of problems with it. And if you didn't have those synergies down, you didn't know those synergies, you would suffer. However, now you have to do both roles in one, and you have to understand how to do both of them at the same time. And it's extremely difficult to do, to the point where nowadays, actually, it's actually better to typically focus on attacking the enemy team as opposed to helping your own team, and just try to be the kaiju who kills all of them before they kill all of yours. Because managing protection and offense is too difficult. Like, it's legitimately too difficult for most gamers, even at the highest level. You're just legitimately asking too much of a single human. What's next? Okay, that was a lot of setup. That was the setup? No way. I think I put a lot more effort into this than any essay I wrote in college. So where do we go from here? At the end of the day, we want to make the game that players want to play. Because of the challenge mentioned previously, we are focusing on making 5v5 the best experience that it can be. However, because we operate as a service to our players, we always remain open-minded to reevaluating our decisions based on your action and feedback, to give you the best game experience we can. Rather than introduce a disruptive, permanent change to the game, we'd prefer to explore the space further and make changes based on that exploration. With that said, we're looking at running a series of events to try out different core team composition formats in Overwatch 2. The community has just once or twice suggested a test. Why not put various forms of 6v6 in the game in order to gauge the results? We agree, and based on your feedback, we're exploring how we can test different forms of 6v6 in the game to gauge the result. This is taking some time, however, for reasons that may not be readily apparent. Yo, am I fucking crazy for reading that and thinking 132? I hope not, right? Like, guys, we tested that at some point. It was fucking shit, right? Like, please. I know you guys aren't. I know you're not that stupid. I know for a fact. I have met many of you. I know it. I know it in my hardest of hearts. But if there's some chance that that's on the table, throw it in the garbage now. The first and honestly largest reason is the need to do this in a way that allows the game to have optimized technical performance. Oh, this is something I actually brought up to Sam and Frito on the podcast when they were arguing sometime. I was like, wait a minute, why the fuck are we even talking about 6v6? Is it even technically possible? Because with the new engine and the game still runs on the fucking Switch, could the Switch even handle 6v6? Probably not. I'm referring to frame rate and memory constraints. With 12 players in a match. I don't know if you've ever played 11 kids versus one dad, but that game mode crashes consistently. There has been quite a few upgrades and additions to Overwatch 2 that have an impact on the performance of the game. These range from new features like allied outlines and enabling healer vision by default, the addition of more technically demanding hero kits, as well as visual upgrades to UI, heroes, and maps in a 6v6, in maps. In a 6v6 setting, these upgrades can have significant impacts for our players, causing the game to underperform on older systems. Overwatch is a fast-paced game, and maintaining a game that runs smoothly across all our platforms is important for players' experience. While a limited time test could arrive sooner, the team is still investigating exactly how long it would take to permanently increase performance across the game. This would be a large effort that would likely take at least several seasons to accomplish. Okay, so we have a timeline on if this was ever going to be implemented, it would take a very long time to even figure out would it be doable. Number one. Number two, I'm kind of been cooking on this whole 7v7 idea. Okay, wow, I'm really gonna say this right now. we're gonna probably go into this later. I really feel for people that are on old gen consoles, but old gen consoles are hindering gaming in so many different ways at the moment. I know of multiple games in the past that have talked about wanting to upgrade or wanting to do certain things, and they can't because old consoles are still being played on, and those consoles are creating giant bottlenecks where you can't do certain things, and the Switch is one of the big ones. And the fact that Overwatch is on the Switch probably creates one of the biggest headaches that this game could have. Is it even an option on the table to no longer have Overwatch on the Switch? Probably not. I don't think anyone in a financial marketing CEO, COO, CFO position would ever put that on the table. I legitimately don't think that would ever be on the table. But like, I don't know if you guys have ever actually played on the Switch. All 15 of the Switch users will riot. I don't know if you've ever actually played Overwatch on the Switch. It is fucking horrid. You're fighting literal orbs, little floating blue orbs that are like, you know when someone's spawning in, you can sometimes see the orb floating for a second, and before the actual thing spawns, like the actual outline, the actual character, they don't even spawn. The thing is, it might be illegal. How would it be illegal though? I mean, I'm no law expert, right? Like, you could be correct, right? But Overwatch is a free game. You wouldn't lose the accounts. The account it's technically tied to the account, right? They would just be ending support for that platform. And I don't think it's illegal to end support on a platform. I'm no expert. Anyways. Another issue, and one that still gives me anxiety about opening this Pandora's box, is what to do with queue times if enough players prefer 6v6 to keep some form of it around. The team was not able to solve this issue previously. While we have some idea now, there is no guarantee that it will work. Is there a world where people are willing to live with long queue times to play this format? No. No, I don't think so, Aaron. No. I was there. Chat, if some of you guys say yes, no. You guys weren't there. I'm telling you. You were not queuing 8 hours of Overwatch a day in the dead time. All the DPS players legitimately became React streamers. I think Jay watched like 12 seasons of Hell's Kitchen. One season of Overwatch. It was awful. It was shit. The average player doesn't want to sit in queue to play for 20 minutes. You guys, no offense, in my Twitch chat right now are hardcore gamers. You're hardcore gamers, whether you like it or not. You are technically a hardcore gamer. You're on Twitch. Most hardcore gamers are on Twitch. And on top of that, you're on Twitch when there's not drops. Because remember, you've been here for a drop day. You know how different it is on a drop day than a normal day here in chat? It's the wild fucking west. Because that's when the casual players come rolling in. That's when they all come strolling in. I'm not speaking for you. I'm speaking generally. They would have to figure out the queue time. And I don't think they could right now. But the current trajectory of the game is ass. It's not fun. And it depends, I guess, on what is the goal of Overwatch. I'll come back to that later. Maybe, but that's a pretty risky move to make. We also have tens of millions of new players that have only played 5v5. We want to be openly mindful to not frustrate those who like the game as today. That's also very valid. The outcomes of these tests would give us a lot of valuable information to consider moving forward. We'd run the test for a few weeks and gauge interest from the community. A few weeks? So it's not a quick play hacked. It's potentially something they try for a few weeks. I'm in love with that idea. It gives people enough time, because if it was just a weekend, nostalgia would take over. Nostalgia would take over, for sure. It would have to be a few weeks. They're right. We tested a few weeks, gauge interest in the community. Then we'd measure the impact it had on other experiences in Overwatch 2, like 5v5, arcade, etc. Oh, it would be its own game mode. Ooh, that's tough, actually. Oh. Uh-oh. We take the lessons from this playtest to see what we can learn about the mode within the current game's ecosystem and for the future of Overwatch. We would reflect carefully on the learnings from from whatever test we run, and explore how to best give players what's being asked for, whether that's a world of 5v5, 6v6, or even both. It is for future us to figure out. I'm going to jump on a soapbox for a moment. When you look at the changes to Overwatch since its inception, it's clear that many of those have reduced some of the variety within an Overwatch match. We get feedback from some players that Overwatch can feel the same from game to game. While much of this gets attributed to 5v5, we feel that there is much more at play here. Besides running experiments with 6v6, we'd like to run some that re-examine the ways that we tried solving previous problems, specifically with the goal of bringing some of that freedom back to an Overwatch match without the severity of issues that accompanied it. For instance, we think there could be other ways of putting a team together that aren't quite as rigid as a set composition, but not as loose as OpenQ. We'll be running at least one quick play hacked based on this idea in Season 13. There are some gotchas to this direction, but after reading 400 pages of this blog, I hope you are all able to see that there are many trade-offs to decisions that go into this and into any game, really. To wrap it up, for now, your feedback has driven both our inspiration and commitment to testing new ideas in-game. We want to be super thoughtful about how we implement new ideas into the live game, because there are millions of players who jump into Overwatch each season, and we want anything we put in-game to benefit the community as a whole. Ultimately, the Overwatch team wants to continue building the game that you want to play season after season. This blog, or thesis rather, is just the start of the conversation. This isn't the last time we're going to be getting into 5v5 or 6v6, and we can't wait to share more about our plans in the future. In closing, we appreciate you so much, and we love seeing your passion and dedication to the game, Team 4, and the Overwatch community. The team hears you, we see you, and we're incredibly thankful to be on this ride with all of you. Can't wait to share more in the upcoming months, and let's make a great game together. Damn. Okay. I want to like, dude, I actually, unironically, I'm getting a headache. Like, legitimately. There's a lot to dissect in here. The biggest argument is technical limitations and 5v5 and queue times. But I fucking told you. I hate to be that guy, but I fucking told you. The thing was never about balance, and, you know, I love Sam. Like, Sam argues a lot about the balance and stuff about the game, but it, like, really wasn't. It's about getting people to play the game and actually get into games, and, you know, the actual experience was part of that as well, you know? And I remember this is something I talked about. It was like, no, like, you know, and I've argued with people, it's like, dude, I don't even argue that today we could probably balance the game in 6v6 better than we did in 5v5. Like, I think today's team is better. But it's like, man, dude, it's fucking crazy, man. At the beginning of this, was doing a little typing. If you didn't see my typing at the beginning, basically, now that this is out there, and now we're talking about 6v6, 5v5, I was wondering if we could do Interview with Aaron, Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. because that was what I originally wanted to talk about a lot. And it was told, push, you know, we'll talk about it later. It tentatively seems like that week will make no date. There's no date and no time. I don't know when. Probably something that'll have to be talked about. But it's looking pretty good. It's looking like we might have a part 2 Electric Boogaloo. Because I have a lot of thoughts of things that I want to say and I want to talk about. The biggest being, holy shit, maybe 6v6 isn't the answer. Maybe 6v6 isn't the answer. And maybe 5v5 isn't the answer. There's a giant fucking disparity. I only see 2 answers. 4v4 or 7v7. 7v7 would be fucking crazy. I don't even know if it's doable. It legitimately might not be possible. 4v4 I think would be too boring, and I saw someone say it at the same time. It would be too boring because it would be too empty. What do you do? Because the biggest problem is literally right here on the screen. That's not possible right now, at least. No, I agree. I don't think it's possible. But this is the most damning piece you've got for anti 6v6. Is that Q times more than doubling for DPS role, which is the most popular role. I don't like when potential solutions are not possible. Because then it puts us into choosing a solution that's possible, but not actually the correct answer. It's just the mostly correct answer. And mostly correct answers still create problems. So it's like basically a battle of lesser of 2 evils. And you can never get players or people to agree on the lesser of 2 evils. That's actually not possible. They never will. Is it time to leave Switch, PlayStation 4, and Xbox behind? First off, don't insult Xbox and PlayStation by putting Switch in the same category as those two. I don't know about Xbox and PS4 limitations, but I would hope those two pieces of hardware are still able to at least keep up, because the Switch 2 has been rumored. The Switch 2, the next one, right? The Switch 2, which is like supposedly coming out like what, soon or next year or something, is rumored to have the capabilities of a PS4. So like, pump the brakes a little bit, right? Like, like the Switch 1 is fucking terrible. That thing is, my phone might have more computing power than a Switch. This has just become the Switch roast, honestly, at this point. I don't know. What does the answer become? I'm gonna have to sit on this. I'm gonna have to think about it a lot. I'm glad they're finally talking about it. Obviously, this doesn't give the answers. Like, if you walked into this thinking they're gonna come out and be like, oh, we're gonna go 5v5, here's why. Oh, we're gonna go 6v6, here's why. You're kind of an idiot. Because the whole point of this was to start the conversation and like be like, okay, here's actually all the facts. What do you guys think? I guess closing thoughts. I love that they did this. I'm glad that they did this. I'm glad they're being open. I would have liked to see a little bit more about like early Overwatch 2 versus late Overwatch 2. Because in my own personal opinion, I feel like the game has declined a lot in the last 6 to 8 months. There was definitely a bump with Season 9, BlizzCon area. But after BlizzCon and then after Season 9, man, we've just been sliding. It doesn't feel like there's much hope. There's nothing to look forward to. There isn't anything big. And I talked about it on the podcast too, like 6v6 isn't going to save the game. 5v5 isn't going to save the game. The fact that there's just nothing to look forward to and there's no marketing for this game, there's nothing exciting, there's nothing to actually pull new players in. Basically the way I want to describe this to you is if you're ever in the shower and you've done this with water and like you can't always keep all the water in there, like eventually it all falls out. Or if you grab a handful of sand, you're holding the sand really tight, eventually all the sand starts to trickle out. You know, at some point you might be able to hold a few pieces and those will never fall out, but you'll never regain the sand you once lost. And Overwatch feels like it's that death of a 1,000 cuts at the moment. And I say that as a streamer, as someone who plays the game way more than they should, even though, to be honest with you, I really don't that much anymore. As much as people sit there like, oh, you just play too much. You should look at my numbers like recently, in the last like 4 to 6 months. No, I haven't. Other than drop days, which drop days is a little bit different. Like I understand that I'm putting myself in mental anguish on those days. I literally can mentally separate myself from those days. I actually can do that quite well. But beyond those, just like I haven't really had much of a desire, and it doesn't really have any like there's anything to look forward to. And I don't think it's just me, and I feel like most players feel that, whether they realize it or not. And typically when you're streamers and players that play a lot feel something, the casual greater base starts to feel it about 3 to 4 months later. I did it with supports being OP. I did it with the PvE stuff. I've done it many times. You know, I feel like I've always been a little bit ahead of the curve, and then eventually later on, everybody kind of catches up. So I'm sorry I don't have a granted, like, this will save the game at the moment, because I actually, low-key, walking into this, I'm going to be completely honest with you, I walked into this thinking I'm going to walk out being a 6v6er. I really thought walking into this I was going to be a 6v6er, and I was actually pretty much leaning on the 6v6 fence walking in. And I was, if you actually remember at the beginning of this thing, I actually said like, oh, it's time to pick a side, and I was going to pick 6v6. I'm not even joking. I really was. And now I read this, I went, ooh, nah, not anymore. Not anymore. Fuck, I'm back in the middle. I hate to admit it, I really was about to become a 6v6er. I really was. I actually was legitimately there. I just wanted this to come out first. And now reading it and looking at the data, it's legitimately impossible. 7v7 is the way. 7v7 is the way forward. Or 4v4. Although 4v4 I think would be kind of boring. But I think 7v7 is the way. It's the only way forward. It's the only way forward that is truly fixes both problems. It fixes the tank synergies issue while also prioritizing the DPS queues because they are the highest player pool, and it keeps queue times as low. It's the only way. It's the only way forward.